We can speak now to Labour's Shadow Northern Ireland Secretary, Peter Kyle. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks.
Before we get on to Northern Ireland, I'm keen to get your sort of reaction, I guess, to the Mark Harper interview. He told me, I know that you're chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Southern Rail, so you may have a bit of a vested interest in the rail strikes. Mark Harper told me that the train operating companies have got permission from him to make a new offer to rail companies. So I guess on the one hand that's good because it shows potentially there could be a breakthrough. But do you think that also perhaps supports the union's argument that it is the government that effectively is pulling the strings here?
Well, it always has been. I mean, if you look at, you mentioned the Southern Rail, I mean, the GTR, who runs Southern Rail and Thameslink, they're actually, it's a contract, not a franchise. And that's now the system which is most broadly right across the country. And it means that they can't do anything without the government saying so. So government sets the fares, sets the time scales. The government sets the stations that each train has to stop at. So the idea that for the entire summer, when all of this unrest was fermenting between staff, workers and unions and the government, when Grant Shapps refused to engage or even meet with unions, it was a really missed opportunity. He should have been round the table. He should have been engaging. The government should have used the influence it has to try and broker some of these deals. So it's good that he's starting to now, but it is an acknowledgement we've had a wasted year.
On the strikes, we've had months of rail strikes. Nurses are saying that more nurses are going to be walking out next month. Teachers are balloting for action too. Are public sector workers right to be taking industrial action?
They have the right to take industrial action, and it's completely understandable as to why they are. We have had the biggest, sharpest, longest fall in real-term wages amongst workers across the public sector. So we understand what the challenges are, and that was going into COVID. After COVID placed enormous stresses and strains on public sector workers, and now we've got the cost of living crisis as well. We can't just look at this in terms of the relationship between workers at their actual jobs. Workers back home, their rents are going through the roof, the energy prices are going through the roof, food costs going through the roof, because our economy is being fundamentally mismanaged, and then they have these challenges at work with the pay, which in real terms has been cut over the last decade. So the mismanagement of the economy is driving this. So it's not surprising that it's spreading from one public service to another and damaging our economy from top to bottom.
I mean, I guess just to put the government sort of come back to that, they would say that above inflation or inflation matching pay rises end up stoking inflation. I'm sure you'll have a view on that as well. But I'm just keen to find out what Labour would do. Because, look, if you look at the polls, you are in line to be the next government. Nurses, for example, looking for a pay rise of around 10%. Is that reasonable? Well,
the interesting thing is that the nurses went into these negotiations asking for inflation plus 5%. And, of course, we in the Labour Party were honest. The economy is in a mess because of the way it's been managed, particularly in the last year with the mini-budget, which blew a hole in it. So we were very honest at the outset and said that that was unrealistic and Labour would not be able to deliver those sorts of things. Now, the nurses have already moved that down to, I think, 10% as their negotiating stance. These are things that are coming out in public. These are things that should be resolved by negotiating in private between employers and the unions.
Just to pull you back to the question, because I do think it's really important. I can understand why you say, look, this is all about the mismanagement of the economy. We totally get why public sector workers are striking. Look at their gas bills. What would you do? What is a fair pay rise?
Well, first of all, look what we did do during the 13 years of the last Labour government.
I don't want to look at what the last Labour government did. I want to look at what the future
Sophie, we are that same
Labour
party.
Would do.
We are that same party. We're the party that respects the public finances. We're the party that gets the economy growing, firing on all cylinders. And we're a party which knows how to manage public services and deals with pay and conditions. So if we were negotiating from now, we would have open negotiations between government and the public sector workers via their unions and with their unions, and we would include pay and conditions in those negotiations, because clearly that's what the unions are asking for, that's what they need. We know that the unions are moving, are willing to move. You can see how the nurses' unions have moved quite considerably from their starting point. The government has to move as well and go in and actually be willing to have negotiations.
What would you do?
Well, Sophie, we're talking about statecraft here. Why is Northern Ireland in such a mess? Because of a failure of statecraft and neglect from the government here. Why is it that when the Prime Minister goes to Scotland, he comes back empty-handed and acrimony and positions widen, they don't heal? Because we have a government that can't do do statecraft 101. They can't get the basics of running any of the relationships that are essential to running an economy, with its public services, the economy more broadly, and its international relationships, but also here domestically across the United Kingdom itself. We need to have a government that takes statecraft, diligence and graft, the basics of running a government, seriously. And when people look at Keir Starmer, and I hope his top team too, they see those qualities in spades.
So I know what you think of Rishi Sunak and his statecraft. I know what you think about the last Labour government, but I'm still a bit unclear about what you'd actually do when it comes to public sector pay.
Well, I've said we will negotiate. We will engage in negotiations on pay and conditions. Rachel Reeves, as Chancellor, would also get the essentials, the basics right of running an economy. We want to reform the economy and get growth into it. We've got the plan to deliver growth from reforming business rates, which would turbocharge small businesses and rejuvenate high streets, right the way through to a green prosperity fund, which will recapitalise and convert our economy to get it ready and equipped for the challenges of net zero. All of these things are things that we would do with the economy to get the basics right, and we would also engage fulsomely in those negotiations with employers. We've done it before, and the next Labour government will do it again.
I've been quite interested to look at Labour's policy on the NHS. Keir Starmer's giving quite a punchy interview today with the Sunday Telegraph, effectively, saying that, look, the NHS, we talk about it as being the admiration for the world, but actually, it's kind of reform or die. Do you think we need to be a bit more honest, I guess, in politics in Westminster about the state of the NHS?
Well, I think Keir, in his article today in the Telegraph, he's been quite starkly honest. It's not the envy of the world. In fact, the world's relationship with the NHS at the moment is a difficult one, because we are now recruiting more doctors from abroad than we are actually producing through training back home. That means that, that the government have turned our NHS and our country into a parasite. We're going around scouring the world looking for talent to bring back to our NHS because we're failing to produce these doctors and nurses domestically. Now, we have a plan by cancelling the non-dom status to fund the doubling of training of doctors, nurses and midwives, and it will be the biggest growth in training in the history of the NHS. But that's the basis of the plan to tackle the workforce challenges we have. We also need to reform the pensions for doctors. We're working with the BMA on that, so we can make sure that people aren't forced to take early retirement and we can get people who have retired back into the service.
I'm interested, you say that we're acting a bit as a parasite, taking doctors and nurses from other countries. Do you think there's something almost a bit morally dubious then, with almost like going to countries, many who are poorer than the UK, and taking the doctors that they've trained?
It's not the sign of a healthy economy, the economy of our NHS, that we are so dependent on taking talent from the rest of the world, and we're incapable. Britain, in the 2020s, is incapable of producing enough doctors for our own needs domestically. So what the Labour Party will do is double the training of doctors and nurses. This government cut 3,000 training places from our universities and our training facilities in the last year, at a time when we need to double it. So this is, again, the mismanagement of our NHS, and also a failure to think long-term and strategically about the future of the NHS. Because if you're not training enough doctors now, then in 5-10 years' time, we're still not going to be able to tackle the problems that we have today. That's why we need to get a Labour government in there with a plan, a fully costed plan, to get the doctors and nurses and midwives into our NHS that we need, who are trained here in our country.
I want to talk to you with your Northern Ireland hat on now. There's been lots of discussion about the protocol, for years, basically, right? You obviously have conversations with people on different sides of the debate. Is it your sense that we might be edging closer to a resolution?
Well, we're certainly hearing that negotiations are going better than before, but we keep on hearing these briefings. We've had 18 months of discussions about mood music rather than content. So we really just need to see what is going to be delivered by these negotiations, rather than just constant negotiations on the tone. It shows just how poor this whole process has been, that we've had a year and a half of conversation about the tone of conversations rather than the content of the conversations.
And you're willing to back the government, effectively, on this?
So the government published its command paper with all of its negotiating stance 18 months ago. The EU did so 15 months ago, and there's a big overlap in the middle. It's about data sharing. It's about the difference between whether we have a fast track or a green lane. We've spent 18 months negotiating over something which really should be dealt with in a matter of weeks, not years. It's extraordinary to me that the previous generation, led by Tony Blair, delivered peace in Northern Ireland. This lot can't get a prawn sandwich across the Irish Sea. So we really need to just get round the table and negotiate, because Northern Ireland has suffered from neglect, neglect from this government here, and the fact that every time we have conversations, positions widen. We need to bring people together because Northern Ireland suffers most. It always does when things go wrong in the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland suffers most.
Just finally, you not only supported a second referendum, you even moved a motion for it in the House of Commons in 2019. You said you felt hurt, angry and betrayed when it didn't get enough support. Has Brexit made us poorer?
Actually, the Brexit deal that Boris Johnson negotiated has made us poorer, and we need to address that. Keir Starmer's been really clear about this. We need to build on that deal. For example,
did any Brexit make us poorer, do you think, though?
I think what we could have done is just fully explored our potential outside of the single market, and that's what the Labour Party aspires to do. I don't think we've touched the sides as a country of what is possible outside of the single market. For example,
wow,
there's
I can't believe you've got Peter Carl saying about the opportunities outside the single market.
Well, Sophie, when things change in politics, when something fundamental happens in politics, you lose a big vote where we have a general election and the country decides to go in a different direction, the political landscape changes, and I'm a politician that respects that. So the political landscape has changed. We're in a new reality, and I accept it, and I fully want to explore the potential that we have as a country right now, not as one that we had 10 years ago. I was very emotionally engaged in that debate. I fought very, very hard. I lost. The country chose a new direction, and we need to fully explore our potential. I don't think we have even touched the sides of what we've done, because the government is governing by ideology. Under Keir Starmer, we're being pragmatic. We want to rebuild the relationships that we have around the country. We want to rebuild our economy out of the rubble of 10 years of austerity, followed by 2 years of crises. We want to make sure that we can rebuild our public services. These are the challenges that we have, and we can only start once we have the general election and get a Prime Minister that actually cares about all of these things in a non-ideological way, but in a way that actually has enthusiasm for the future of the country, not the kind of doom and gloom and the governing by row that we have with the Tories.
OK, we are out of time. Thanks very much for being on the programme and coming into the studio today.
Thanks.